Peace. This is King Noble Black Supremacy. And with this particular video, I want to show how America is exposing itself. The recent events. We're not going through problematic times in America. America is fundamentally flawed. Super contradictive. It cannot work. It is illogical. It is an ideological conundrum of fuckery that requires you to believe in. It's a cult. It's an advanced cult. And I'll show you that in this video. Let's deal with recent events. Let's deal with the Virginia white supremacist neo-Nazi rally in Charlottesville. Let's talk about that. You have white supremacist neo-Nazis who come out and plan a rally to espouse their white supremacist views and their alt-right conservative white nationalist agenda in America, to rally up energy and support and propagandize their beliefs and ideologies. This is well within their constitutional right. They have a right. According to the United States Constitution, they have a right to come out and express their freedom of opinion, their freedom of beliefs and ideas, their freedom of speech. But some other groups don't think so. Black Lives Matter, Antifa, socialist movements, anti-white supremacist groups, they don't agree that these white supremacists have the right to come out and express their views. So they come out against them. And they're using their freedom of speech to freely be against someone else's freedom of speech. I mean, if that's not ideologically flawed, if that's not fundamentally flawed, systematically, based on how the rights of the people is framed in this country, then I think you might need to look again. So these white supremacists come out to share their views. Because like I said, according to the Constitution or whatever, their freedom of speech, they have a right to come out and spew out hatred, bigotry, racism, the type of stuff that ultimately gets people amped up to kill people that are minorities, or to treat minorities or blacks unfairly, to be discriminate, to show hatred and just be ignorant against other races and nationalities of people. They have a right to do that in America. You have the freedom to speak out against minorities, to lord yourself over them. You have the freedom to hate people that don't look like you and speak out on that. But while you have the freedom to speak out on it, if someone acts on it, or your speech motivates someone to act on it, then that's a hate crime. But you have the freedom to engage in speech that could lead to or cause hate crimes in this country. If they find out your speech is causing these hate crimes, then they criminalize you and make you responsible for the hate crimes that other people committed. Not even you, just your speech did it. But you were freedom to speak it. But the fact that you spoke it and you're responsible for it happening, they'll eventually stop you from speaking on it, so they can stop the negative shit from happening. And they'll find a way to do that. So honestly, in this America, freedom of speech is an illusion. You got the freedom to speak until somebody who hears you don't like you. And if somebody don't hear you If somebody that hears you that don't like you is a part of the government, then they'll find a way to criminalize you. If they're not a part of the government, then they might just outright come out and attack you, try to murder you. But as you can see in the rally in Charlottesville, the police wasn't trying to protect anybody's freedom of speech. So what the hell is freedom of speech if it's really not protected? If you can come out and have your freedom to speak against those who are using their free speech to spew out racism and hatred and racial epithets and bigotry, you come out and you say, hell, well, I'm going to use my freedom of speech to counter that. And you find out that day that nobody's freedom of speech is being protected. The police ain't protecting freedom of speech that day. They're off. So vehicles run in the crowd and smash and tumble like a bowling alley, run over people and knock them out the way like bowling pins. So the freedom of speech that you thought you had, that someone else was free to speak against what you were speaking about, was not even protected. If that's not fuckery, please tell me what is. So nobody's freedom of speech was protected that day. That was uncivilized savagery, brutality, bestiality. And you call that America. Because the fundamental principles of which America is supposed to stand on, one of them being the freedom of speech, is not functional, not logical, and not rational. How could you back somebody that's speaking out racism and hatred that's going to lead to hate crimes and inhumane mistreatment of people within this country because they have a right to speak on it? How do you do it? Why does somebody have a right to speak out hatred? I mean, does that make sense? I mean, we all hold these amendments to be so valuable, and yeah, we have freedom of speech. But should someone be free to degrade and desecrate and condescend people because of the color of their skin? Should they be able to do that? Are we proud that you have the freedom to speak out fuckery? And is it smart to use your freedom of speech in a way that's going to cause yourself harm and harms to others? Could freedom of speech be a trap to get yourself harmed or to get other people's harmed? Because it's not even really protected by any government. Because they simply can't do that. And you see that in Charlottesville. That the event was deemed at some point after the bowling ball car crash as an unlawful event. And they wanted the people to disperse. But them coming out spewing out hatred was a lawful event. Them dividing America, creating disunity, creating hatred. That was a lawful event. That was backed by something. Call it the Constitution, the amendments, something backed that. We live in a country that backs people to do that. And by living in a country that allows people to do that, it allows people to get ran over by cars like you just saw in Virginia. It allows people to get murdered, to get killed. This country supports domestic terrorism. It supports homegrown terrorism because what comes out of the type of hate speech that we saw was terrorism that day. Terrorism by the white supremacist group. Terrorism by the white supremacist movement. That's what we saw happen. So this country supports it. and accepts homegrown terrorism by white supremacy as being a part of this country. Because hell, the First Amendment backs it. Freedom of speech back what they did. And then to move on from that, because I'm sure you see the fuckery. That if free speech, if that's what it lead to, what we saw in Charlottesville, Virginia, then we need to amend the Constitution. Because now people are free to speak on something that's going to motivate others to go out and harm others. Should they be free to speak on that? Should somebody stop them before somebody get harmed or somebody get hurt? Before they get harmed, before they get hurt? Why are we so proud about freedom of speech? Is that logical? Is that rational? Is that practical? And does it even exist? You're free to speak to someone do not like you, or to someone does not agree with what you're saying has power. Bottom line. So then we go over to Trump. After the massacre we saw, over dozens of people, several dozens of people injured, 3 people dead so far, in this white supremacist terrorist massacre of people exercising their free speech against something that should not be allowed, which was hatred and bigotry through speech in this country. Because they hide their perpetuation and continuation of inhumane and injustice through allowing it through freedom of speech. That's how they remain neutral about it, to allow it to go on. While they claim to be against it, they should be man enough to stop people from doing it. Because it is stuff that they stop people from speaking on. All the time. But then they go over to Trump and say, you know what? What's your thoughts of what happened in Charlottesville, Virginia? What you think about that? How you feel about that, Trump? And he said, he said the hatred and the violence on all sides must stop. On all sides, not just the white supremacist nationalists, also the Black Lives Matter, the socialists, on all sides, it must stop. So let's see, did all sides put this event together? Let's look at this. The white supremacists put this event together. So they initiated the hatred, the polarization, the racism. They initiated it. So all sides didn't put this event together. One side did. And another side countered the hatred, countered the racism and bigotry. So everybody out there, all sides did not do it. And all sides didn't run a car into a crowd of people that was against the hatred and bigotry that the white nationalists, white supremacists, alt-right people put on. They were just against it. One side was against it. And that side that was against it got ran over by a car. And dozens of that one side was injured, and 3 of that side was dead. So how could it be hatred and violence on all sides? One side put together this event. One side promoted this polarization that led to what we saw. But Trump said, I see the hatred of all sides. It has to end. Now he's right and wrong. He's right because, for one, if people want to be white supremacists and nationalists and come out and spew out they shit under the United States Constitution, they should be allowed to. The Constitution doesn't tell you what the parameters of what your free speech can be. YouTube might say that. Facebook might say that. Zuckerberg. But the United States Constitution doesn't tell you what the limitations or the parameters of free speech is. So the white nationalists should be able to come out and spew out their free speech for all people who are lovers of free speech. No matter how contradictory, irresponsible, you know what I'm saying, and highly volatile that is. Because that free speech is irresponsible, it's dangerous, it's highly volatile. It's a bad idea to begin with that this country has been holding on to. It's senseless and will lead to senseless violence and senseless barbaric situations when everybody is just screaming out of freedom. But their freedom is against somebody else that's screaming out against them at the same time, and they all had a right to do it, and you tell me that's not going to end up in fuckery. But the white nationalists have a right to go out there and speak out without being attacked for expressing their free views according to the contradictory, foolish Constitution, which is a whole nother video. So by people attacking them for coming out sharing their fuckery views, that was wrong. And that makes the people who attack them for their freedom of speech try to curtail their freedom of speech with counter protesting and violence, makes them wrong, and also makes them somewhat responsible for getting ran over like bowling pins for those groups that was simply trying to protect their freedom of speech by trying to have their own rally and express their own peaceful views and ideas. Because that so-called white supremacist group didn't descend on any just neighborhood or any group. They could have descended on a black neighborhood to cause harm, to cause violence. They could have descended on, marched into a community with the objective to destroy and tear up that community on some Greek or Roman type shit. But they didn't. They decided to have a peaceful rally to express their fuckery ideas to the world, to rally people around those fuckery ideas, which they have a right to under the Constitution. It would have been a peaceful event if there was no counter protesters there to challenge their freedom of speech to say the things that they were saying. So in a way, Trump was right. That the events that took place that night, the violence, was agitated by counter protesters. And the white supremacist groups was purely somewhat trying to defend their right to have their freedom of speech with their fuckery, barbaric, caveman ass ideas. So that's how Trump was right. So he doesn't have to condemn the white supremacist groups. Why do he have to condemn anything? That the white supremacy, white nationalism is just a perspective. It's just a view of many views that you can have. And they can have that view. You can't condemn their right to have a view or use condemnation as a method to curtail their right to have freedom of speech or to somewhat try to censor them because you don't agree with them. According to the Constitution, they have a right to have a free speech and their ideas and their opinions, and that's just that. That's just what it is. You have to accept that. So why should Trump have to condemn? Why is his condemnation of somebody's freedom necessary? Why? Why is it necessary that he condemns their opinion when they're free to have it and free to express it? And what if Trump agrees with white supremacy? That's his freedom to his opinion and his perspective. Are you forcing him to denounce white supremacy? And that may be his belief and what he believes in, and he may identify with that. So he's not free to agree and not condemn, or agree with who he want to agree with and condemn whoever he feels like condemning. He's not free to do that. Just like they're not free to go out and have a rally, and they don't really have freedom of speech because these other groups are going to come and attack them to shut down their event because they don't believe they should be free to say what they're saying. And through condemnation, the world can take a certain attitude towards the white supremacist groups and then ultimately censor them. So what is freedom of speech other than some counter protesters getting slain and murdered and white terrorism being brewed right here at home? Homemade white terrorism, homemade in the USA. So Trump was right and wrong. The wrong part about Trump is that, for one, white supremacy should not be accepted at all. It should be fuck the Constitution, fuck the freedom of speech. White supremacy is wrong. That's what this country is supposed to be against. Racism and bigotry. But you can't be against racism and bigotry and then be for freedom of speech at the same time. You can't do that. Because if you're for freedom of speech, you're for people to have whatever free ideas that they want to have, whether they're racist, bigotry, sexist, it doesn't matter. That's why it's called freedom. So you can't be against anything and be for freedom. And that's the paradox of the Constitution and the paradox of the freedom of speech. It just becomes a weapon of the elite to play political football with people, to keep their agenda going, because the police departments will support who they want to support and support who they agree with and support who funds them. It's not about freedom of speech. It's about freedom of condemnation, freedom of support, freedom of political interests, freedom of political agenda, not speech. So no bigotry or racist, sexist, or whatever ideology should be allowed to be spoken. Or this shit gonna go on forever. This bullshit will continue to exist. It will never stop as long as you leave the door open for people to have the freedom to speak on these things and move into these different perspectives. So America is fundamentally flawed. Why would Trump condemn white nationalists? He's condemning these people from having a right to have whatever views that they want to have. Why would he? But he'll condemn those that speak out against police brutality, because he don't really agree with those views. Whatever views you agree with, you don't condemn. Whatever views you don't agree with, you don't condemn. You use condemnation and censorship. And it ain't about freedom of speech. It's about who those in power agree with and who those in power don't agree with. And they keep all the masses of people in confusion, thinking they have freedoms that they don't have. Because the police, if they didn't agree with the white supremacists, if the police did not agree in Virginia, Charlottesville, they didn't agree with the white supremacists, they would have protected the protesters. But they fell back because they knew the white supremacists had shields and had all the protective gear that they needed to defend themselves. So they didn't feel no need to defend the freedom of speech of those of whom they agreed. So they refused to defend the counter protesters. So they just fell back. Wasn't about freedom of speech. No person in this country gives a fuck about freedom of speech. They're not disciplined enough. They're not enlightened enough. They're not intelligent enough to care about any fucking freedom of speech. And you'll find out how much they don't give a fuck about it when somebody says something that they don't agree with. This country has nothing to do with any kind of freedom at all. That's just all bullshit. And how they keep pretending like they are, that paradox, is what keeps this savagery, this bullshit going. This political anarchy keeps it going. Because it's fundamentally flawed. It makes room and leaves the door open for the bullshit that it claims to be absolutely against. But it can't be absolutely against anything if it still fights to defend and protect freedom. But then sets the parameters of what freedom is. It's fundamentally flawed. Period. It can never be reformed. There's no such thing as progress. Just the whole idea of making America great again, as though it was great in the past, removes all progress that happened within the last 50 years. There's no such thing as progress in this country. It's a seesaw. It's a pendulum that swings back and forth from bullshit to bullshit. And it backs this fucking wrestling match. This is every man for himself Royal Rumble. It backs this shit up with nukes and weapons and military. It backs this fuckery over here. This is part one. This is King Noble Black Supremacy. Join my website, www.kingnobleuncensored.com. Subscribe to my YouTube page now, King Noble Guru. Hit the subscribe button. Hit the like button for this video. And hit the bell to turn your notifications on so you can get notifications every time I put out a video to be the first to know what's going on and get informed about the Black Supremacy movement. I'll be back with a part two. Black Supremacy.